Welcome back to iCulture for a special bonus deep dive. For all of our listeners out there intrigued by Asia and international politics, we're tackling a question that might seem simple at first, but it gets surprisingly complex. What exactly is Southeast Asia?
It's a region we hear about constantly, but have you ever really stopped to think about it? I mean, is it just a name we put on a map? Or is there something more to it?
Right, it really makes you think. And we've got some really fascinating research to unpack here. Excerpts from academic papers, articles, all sorts of things. Some of them are a bit older, so you'll hear Myanmar referred to as Burma. Just a heads up. And full transparency, this deep dive is AI generated. But don't worry, our amazing researcher Bastian Freiburg has fact-checked every single detail.
That's key. We definitely want to be accurate here. But to kick things off, maybe we should start with a really basic question. Does the label Southeast Asia really matter in the grand scheme of things? Or are we just getting hung up on semantics?
Yeah, it's like that famous Shakespeare line, what's in a name? Would a rose smell any different if we decided to call it something else? But then again, when it comes to geopolitics, names seem to carry a lot of weight, don't they?
Absolutely. Labels like Southeast Asia, they're tools, useful for discussion, but they're not necessarily absolute truths. You know, it's kind of like those categories that scientists use for plants and animals. Helpful for organizing our knowledge, for sure. But nature doesn't always fit neatly into those boxes.
And when it comes to regions, those boxes are often drawn from a very specific perspective, which can have some pretty major consequences. Our sources actually trace the word Asia way back to the Hittites, around 1235 BC.
Wow, that's going way back.
Right, they use this term Asuva for a place or a people, and over time it evolved into the Asia we know today.
Okay, so Asia has ancient roots, but what about Southeast Asia? Is that just as old?
That's where things get interesting.
Yeah.
Southeast Asia is actually a much more recent term. It was basically imposed on the region during colonization, defined from a very Western point of view.
So not exactly coming from within the region itself. That makes sense.
Yeah, and to define it, they use China and India as their landmarks.
Yeah.
So basically, south of China, east of India, boom. You've got Southeast Asia. It really makes you wonder how arbitrary these regional labels can be.
Completely. It all comes down to your perspective and whose landmarks you consider to be the most important.
It reminds me of when I was traveling in northeastern Thailand in a region called Isan. The language they spoke there sounded so much like Lao, and I later found out that many people in Isan are actually descended from Laotians. The Mekong River, which is now the border between Thailand and Laos, cuts right through their cultural homeland.
That's a perfect example of how political borders, which were often drawn by outside forces, can actually split communities that share the same languages and cultures.
Yeah, and we see that in so many places around the world. Look at Africa's colonial borders or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
It's a really stark reminder that these seemingly straightforward geographic labels can actually carry a lot of historical and political baggage with them, and unfortunately, sometimes that baggage leads to conflict.
Absolutely. So we've talked about how Southeast Asia was largely defined by outsiders, but how is it viewed from within the region itself?
That's where things get even more complex. Our sources point out that there's no single unified internal perspective on Southeast Asia. After World War II, there were even debates among scholars about which countries should be included in the region.
You know, one of our sources actually used the word unicorn to describe Southeast Asia. They argued that it's not inherently real, but it's made real through belief and discussion.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. The more we talk about Southeast Asia as a single unit, the more these diverse nations start to see themselves as part of a collective.
That makes sense. But even with all of this ambiguity, some kind of consensus eventually emerged, right?
You're right. By the late 1970s, there was a general agreement that Southeast Asia included 10 specific nations: Burma, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Brunei. So that's the lineup we know today. Case closed?
Well, not quite. We still see border disputes popping up, particularly between Vietnam and China, which reminds us that those lines on the map aren't always as settled as they might seem, and that lingering fluidity just speaks to some even deeper questions about who gets to define Southeast Asia and what exactly is at stake in that definition.
Okay, so we've established that Southeast Asia isn't this like naturally occurring region, it's more of a construct.
But that doesn't mean it's completely meaningless.
Right. That's what I was thinking about. If we're thinking about Southeast Asia as a tool,
Yeah.
how has it actually been used in the real world? Like, what are the implications of having this label?
Well, for one thing, it's created a sense of shared identity among these nations, even if that identity is somewhat artificial.
Okay, I can see that. How does that work?
It's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we use the term Southeast Asia, the more these diverse nations start to think of themselves as part of a collective.
Interesting. So a shared identity, even if it's constructed, can actually be a powerful force. But I imagine there's some downsides too, right?
Oh, absolutely. It can bring people together, but it can also gloss over some really important differences between those people.
Right, because Southeast Asia includes 10 very different countries, each with its own unique history and culture and a set of challenges. Lumping them all together under one label could lead to some pretty dangerous generalizations.
Exactly. It's like assuming that everyone in Europe has the same values and experiences. Obviously, that's not true. And the same goes for Southeast Asia. You've got incredible diversity within that region, from languages and religions to political systems and economic development.
Okay, so it sounds like Southeast Asia can be a useful concept for understanding broad trends and fostering some cooperation. But we have to be really careful not to oversimplify things. We need to remember that there are individual stories and nuances within this region.
Absolutely. And even when we acknowledge all of those complexities, we're still left with some pretty tricky questions.
Like what?
Well, for example, we talked about the fluidity of borders, especially in the context of Vietnam and China. Those disputes raise some important questions about who gets to define the boundaries of Southeast Asia and what's at stake when those boundaries are being drawn.
So we're basically back to those externally imposed borders that we were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
The legacy of colonialism is still having a huge impact on this region, even as these Southeast Asian nations are trying to assert their own identities and interests on the global stage.
It's this fascinating paradox. On the one hand, you have the region striving for unity and a shared identity. But on the other hand, you have individual nations that are trying to carve out their own unique paths, pursuing their own economic and political goals.
That reminds me of what we were discussing earlier about collective bargaining power. We mentioned how Southeast Asia could potentially give the region a stronger voice on the international stage. But at the same time, that unified voice could end up silencing individual nations and preventing them from pursuing their own unique foreign policy goals.
It's this delicate balancing act, for sure. And then you have to throw China into the mix.
Oh, right. China's growing influence in the region.
Yeah.
That has to be having a major impact on how these nations think about their place in the world.
Absolutely. China's economic and military power is undeniable. And it's forcing these countries to reevaluate their relationships with each other and with global powers like the United States.
So how does all of this play out? I mean, does China's influence strengthen the idea of a unified Southeast Asia as a way to counterbalance that power? Or does it actually push nations to prioritize their own individual relationships with China, potentially undermining that regional solidarity?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. It's like this complex geopolitical chess game with so many moving pieces.
This is also fascinating.
Yeah.
We've gone from talking about the origins of the word Asia to unicorn analogies to geopolitical power plays. I'm really starting to see how multi-layered and significant this whole idea of Southeast Asia really is.
And we've only scratched the surface. There's so many more dimensions we could explore. The impact of globalization, the struggle for democracy in certain countries, the region's incredibly rich cultural tapestry. It's really captivating.
I know, right?
Mm.
It feels like we could do an entire series of deep dives just on this one region. But for now, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about.
Southeast Asia, it really is a region that's full of possibilities. But I think if we step back from all the details for a second, we have to ask ourselves a really important question. Is Southeast Asia ultimately a helpful concept, or does it actually do more harm than good?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? We've seen how this label can be used as a tool, but like any tool, it can be used in different ways with different outcomes. So what do you think?
Well, one thing that makes me hopeful is that Southeast Asian nations are starting to take ownership of this narrative. They're not just letting outsiders define it for them anymore.
Oh, okay, so they're shaping the definition of Southeast Asia based on their own goals.
Exactly. They want it to reflect their own aspirations and priorities.
So we're talking about organizations like ASEAN again, right? Taking collective action on issues that are important to the whole region.
ASEAN is definitely a key player. But it goes beyond that, too. We're seeing Southeast Asian countries working together on all sorts of things, from climate change to cybersecurity. They're forging their own path on the world stage.
Okay, so it sounds like the region is becoming more proactive. It's not just about reacting to outside pressure anymore.
Right. It's about shaping their own destiny.
Hmm.
And that's where things get really interesting. Well, as these nations continue to integrate economically and politically, will Southeast Asia eventually move beyond just being a construct? Will it become something more?
I see what you're saying. Will it become less of a label and more of a lived reality, like a shared identity that goes deeper than just convenience?
Exactly. That's the question I want to leave our listeners with. What do you think? Is Southeast Asia always going to be just a construct? Or can it actually evolve into something more profound? A true reflection of the region's history and culture and aspirations?
Wow, that's a great question to think about. It really makes you consider how we define regions and identities in a world that's becoming more and more interconnected. Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the heart of what Southeast Asia really means.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you, and hopefully we've given our listeners some food for thought.
And to all of you listening out there, keep those brains buzzing. We'll catch you on the next episode of iCulture